we were able to use conditionals and global values to implement modes in our game. Now we're going to use functions to refactor the game and make it easier to read. Now that we have modes in our game, one pattern we can look for is if we can extract the logic for one mode into its own function. The other part of the pattern I'm looking for is that the mode doesn't directly change any global values, and that it can take in some values and output some values. And that's basically what a function does. So we can see here inside of the part that represents the dice game itself, this block of code is self-contained. It represents everything I want to do for the dice game. And it takes in some values and it gives back the message that we want to show to the user. So now I'm going to extract this into a function. I'm going to call this function dice game. And I know it needs to have the same functionality as the code that I currently have. And I want to think about this section of code. What are the values that it deals with? And these are going to be the inputs to our function. And what are the values that it creates? And those are going to be the return values. So the values that it deals with are the username and the input. So I'm going to make those parameters of my function. And I want it to return the message. So I'm going to create the value that I want it to return, and then I'm going to write the return keyword that returns it. And then in the middle is all of the logic for my dice game. So now I can just simply copy and paste the values from my code up here. Into my function. And I changed the name of one thing, which is my output value. I called this message here. And now I've defined this variable, and now I can use it where I took out my code. And so I'm going to call the function with two parentheses, and I want to put in my values, which are username and input. And the value that comes out of this is my output value. And one other thing here is that now that I've encapsulated my function, my dice game inside this function, I don't have to use the word input anymore. Dice game, when I execute the function, I am putting in the values input, which come from the main function and username. And now I can name these two values whatever I want. So I just know that the first thing to come in is the first thing over here in the function, and the second thing to come in is the second thing over here in the function declaration. So I can name these that a name that represents, more closely represents what they actually are. So I think a name that's more appropriate would be user guess. And then I would have to replace that inside of the rest of my code. Now let's take a look at the advantages I've gained through refactoring my code and extracting out the dice game into its own function. First is in the conditional, my code reads much cleaner. And it's much more explicit about the fact that when current game mode is dice game, that the dice game happens. And because I've named my function appropriately, then this line is much more succinct about what's happening. The second thing that happened is that inside of the function itself, I was able to rename the parameter so that it is more appropriate to actually what's happening. And my messages look cleaner. And also my logic here looks cleaner as well. And it's self-contained inside this function, which is a little bit easier to read.